I don't think this video will be liked because I cannot seem to appeal to either side of the torn Chainsaw Man community. On one hand, people enjoy what Chainsaw Man is doing currently, and the other, people hate what Chainsaw Man is doing. I guess I find myself not loving everything, but also not hating everything. I'm kind of in the middle. I have my issues, my concerns, my worries with how Fujimoto is approaching and handling this narrative, both macro and micro, but I wouldn't say I hate it. I'm also open to giving Fujimoto time to build these chapters, to read them sequentially one after the other rather than through a weekly lens. Part 2 has a high focus of character-driven moments. On a micro level, that comes in the form of development. But what if that development is circular? What if it's the same thing? What if it keeps treading a similar water? Naturally, people are probably not going to like that. And I guess it would all depend on how much focus you put on those repeating moments. Is this something massive and revolutionary that we've already seen before? Or is this something that is trickling down into being obscure and watered down? What I'm trying to say is that I don't think I understand the true hate that people have for Chainsaw Man currently. While I understand the bits and pieces, the broader strokes, in terms of its core, I'm not too concrete on that. I see people hate this story for a lot of reasons. For Denji, its repetition, for Yoru and her actions or personality, for the slow-moving macro story in regards to death and this whole prophecy. If I were to guess, just putting things together, it boils down to Denji's assault and the continued treading of that same water. That every time we play into Denji's assault, instead of getting potential growth or characterization or development on top of the stuff that we have had, we play into a joke or a meme or a funny, quirky, quippy moment. And for many, perhaps that waters down the experience, turning Denji's development and characterization through understanding what type of things are happening to him back to being trivial almost, back to being potentially pointless. So I guess the question is that if people dislike that approach, do you think it's reducing Denji's character overall, making him partially insignificant? However, there is an extended question to that. How much focus is on that assault? And how much of that can be favored to the side of unlikable, quirky and quippy compared to devaluing and reversing Denji's progression? It might sound complicated, but you can perceive those two things independently. What I am trying to say is these past recent chapters haven't had much focus on Denji's assault. While it has been there, it hasn't been the primary focus of the chapter. It hasn't been the spotlight. And I think if you go back and read chapters with Denji in a similar circumstance, the power of the moment is entirely dependent on its focus towards that assault. For example, the recent stuff, it's been insignificant, it's been minuscule, and because of that, maybe it's why you dislike the utilage of it. I guess to bring it to some sort of closure, either you liking or hating Chainsaw Man obviously is entirely up to you, but Fujimoto works best in chunks, I would say. A lot of his best work has been within the entire picture, not just the slice of a weekly chapter that we get. It doesn't negate the weekly experience, but for me, and I felt like this since the beginning of part 2, and the reason why he changed magazines to begin with, is that he's not writing this as a weekly story. Not once have I viewed Chainsaw Man Part 2 as a weekly reading experience compared to its competition. Instead, it feels like the story is being cut and sliced to artificially be placed within a weekly slot. I guess a way to gauge that is a complaint people had a while ago where Chainsaw Man felt very, very slow, that the progression or the pacing between multiple chapters felt very, very small. Personally, I took that as a prime example of Fujimoto writing in batches, that narratively he is writing a much bigger story and then cutting it up to fit a weekly release schedule to some degree. But then that weekly schedule gets thrown off because technically he doesn't have a weekly story because he can take breaks. Throughout the beginning of the story, it was heavily bi-weekly. Sometimes you would take even longer breaks. So really, what this story boils down to is something that is being, at least for me, written in a much bigger picture all at once and then placed into smaller chunks for people to feast upon. And because of that, you may get an odd weekly reading experience. More so if you're reading multiple works. Trying to compare a chapter like this that feels like it goes nowhere and is kind of circling on itself and the character drama compared to anything else that might feel more progression heavy. The beauty of it is within the details, something that Fujimoto shines at doing. Part 2 has been a character drama and Fujimoto likes to play into that heavily. This chapter here feels like one of those moments where you're getting raw and honest feelings from either character. Perhaps it's safe to say people didn't have a problem with what this chapter was doing until the end. But again, focus, the spotlight. I would say Denji is not the spotlight here, but Yoru takes the mantle. Because at the moment, you're seeing a side of Yoru that is incredibly different. This is not like anything that we have seen. She's playing into a realm of playful, egotistical manner, but there's also certain moments that feel oddly sensitive. Almost like she wants to enjoy and indulge within the experience that she's currently having. Whether it be overly playful to the characteristics that she has, both the assault at the end, but also the semantics at the beginning, but then the smaller moments where she's listening to Denji, where she's offering to cook him food. Do you see how Yoru is being balanced currently? It feels like we are proportionally building up to this massive moment of realization from both characters, but with Yoru it comes down to weaponization. If I were to give her a reasoning on why she's acting like this, it's because she's trying to build up a sense of guilt towards Denji. This would in turn add to Denji turning into a weapon. The question, if that's the case, is she flipping on this personality to try and force herself to feel that type of way, or is it something that she's trying to naturally feel out? She has no reason to listen to Denji talk about power or mention friends or the control devil or even care about the fire devil or death in general, but she's listening and very intently, something that she doesn't do just for anybody. When you compare the type of character she is towards the end of the chapter compared to the previous one, where she is over the top and egotistical, almost childlike in her demeanor, it's almost night and day. Denji is also currently dealing with the fact that he's experiencing two different individuals, but he's only perceiving one. There could very much be a massive mental gymnastics on who is currently in front of him. It's not like he can visually see the Yoru scars or eyes, so his perception of Yoru is torn between two individuals and not sure where either personality sits. So when you have Yoru kind of jumping between these massive differences of egotistical to sensitive and slow, I could imagine that'd be rather confusing for Denji. But he feels comfortable. And that's one of the more bigger things that I find rather interesting, is that through the chaoticness of what Yoru is supplying, he still views her as a friend. Through the assault, through the recognition of himself. In terms of that value, it is incredibly important to him as an individual. Not being alone, having fun, enjoying himself for what it's worth is much higher than the wrongs or the negatives that are within. There is a powerful moment of recognition here where even Yoru responds with, she's going to turn him into a weapon, and he doesn't care. His moments feel almost entirely isolated to the events themselves, almost like they don't blur together, or that his lifestyle or mind towards his lifestyle is pieced in sequences. I guess a way to view it is that he barely recognizes the past. He barely recognizes part 1. He barely recognizes his childhood. He barely recognizes the beginning of part 2. It's almost like past a certain point he forgets or just seals it off and then moves on to the next mindset that he wants to enjoy himself within. The end of the day is that he is kind of putting himself first, which it is a power to behold. But at the same time, he's still being manipulated, abused and assaulted within different circumstances. Whether he recognizes or not currently doesn't really matter, and that might just be because he has such a very clear understanding of himself and what he values more. I think at this point it should also be remembered that there is a lingering trauma of Naoyuta that is gone, and if she truly is dead and gone, he's trying to come to terms with that. He has not been the same since Naoyuta died. His interactions with people has changed, his viewpoint viewpoint of things have changed. So when something kind of nice comes along, when a friend is born through this weird murkiness, I can imagine he values that a lot. In part, he might even slightly compare it to the likes of Pochita, having a friend in some way, shape or form that he perceives it as being his own, whether it's normal or not. Pochita was not a normal friend, and neither is Yoru or Asa. I guess what I'm trying to say is that normalcy for Denji doesn't really exist, but I appreciate Fujimoto's attempt to round these two characters together, to have them on the exact same footing, because quite easily he could have just made Yoru an entire menace this entire chapter. It's just when you get to the ending where it's like, why? What's the reason? Why play into this again? There was an important piece of information revealed, that when Death makes an appearance, high-ranking devils will greet her. We don't know what or who that entails, but I do think we are ushering in what potentially is the finale of the story, or at least the major arc or the climax of what this story is. This is what part 2 has always been about, this prophecy, this appearance of the Death Devil, and it feels like we're right there. When I think about it, even through all of the back and forth that the community might have, it feels rather nihilistic. This ending could just be very dark and grey, that maybe there isn't really a good outcome for this, a good outcome for Denji, a good outcome for the world. When it comes to endings, Fujimoto is very unpredictable. Anything is possible, and just maybe we're spiraling down that corridor to meet the end and the Death Devil itself.